The Second World War brought the world to its knees. The horrors that occurred at concentration camps, such as Auschwitz, shocked the world and continues to be a tragic historical lesson about man's cruelty to his fellow man. Based on their profound contempt for other races, religions, and social classes, the Nazis' shocking lack of humanity was immaculately displayed by an intricate and pervasive system of concentration camps. After the defeat of Hitler and Nazi Germany, what has become the fate of the site where some of the world's most inhumane atrocities were committed? Brace yourself and let's examine the horrors and what happened to concentration camps after World War II. The camps. To fully understand the terror that occurred in these buildings, it's important that we take a step back to understand that not all camps were concentration camps. No, in truth, there were different types of camps used by the Nazis for different purposes, like extermination camps designed specifically to eliminate races and people deemed degenerate, or concentration camps designed to debase and confine political prisoners and the like. Some of the camps you're familiar with were complexes with a mix of several camps performing different functions. So, let's set the tone by going through 4 forms of camps you'd find in Nazi Germany: the forced labor camps, extermination camps, transit camps, and concentration camps. Then I'll explain what happened to some of the most popular ones you probably already know after the Second World War. First up is extermination camps, also known as death camps or killing centers. These were used by the Nazis from 1941 to 1945 to murder Jews. The Nazis established camps in occupied Poland in late 1941 and early 1942 with the primary objective of mass murder. The camps were designed to gas hundreds of thousands of Jews to death. Next is the labor camp system. You see, just after gaining power, the Nazis implemented forced labor. Ostarbeiter, meaning Eastern workers, and Fremdarbeiter, meaning foreign workers, together with other forced laborers, were picked up and brought in from the East and were held in specific labor camps that were built. These were distinct from the concentration camps where inmates were also made to work. The invasion of the Soviet Union also placed thousands of potential new workers under Nazi rule. These people were sent by the Nazis to work in construction projects or in forced labor camps to generate goods for the strained war economy, as well as repair bombed railroads and bridges, or work on farms and in stone quarries. The third, and often overlooked camp system, was the transit camps. These were camps where prisoners were briefly detained prior to deportation to other Nazi camps. After the Second World War began, the Nazis took control of several nations. Numerous transit camps were built as a result of these practices throughout the various occupied nations. Prior to being sent to other camps like Auschwitz, prisoners were housed at these camps. Overall, the transit camp's circumstances were dreadful and akin to those of concentration camps, and that's the last type of camp we'll look at now. They were easily the most well-known and notorious of all Nazi camps, and the first concentration camp of the Nazi administration was founded in the town of Dachau, located approximately 10 miles northwest of Munich, on March 22, 1933, just a few months after Adolf Hitler was named German Chancellor. It became a blueprint for the concentration camp system in general, which grew rapidly after the SS, the Schutzstaffel, under Heinrich Himmler, consolidated control over the whole system in 1934. The Nazi camp system was greatly expanded as World War II broke out, both within Germany and throughout occupied Europe. During the 6 years of the war, there were over 40,000 camps around the continent, housing millions of prisoners. Now let's take a look at some of the most cruel concentration camps, how they were liberated, and what they have been made into today. Auschwitz. Auschwitz-Birkenau is the most infamous of all Nazi camps. The day of its liberation by the Soviet troops, the 27th of January, is commemorated as Holocaust Memorial Day. Over 1.1 million people were murdered at this site, with over 90% of them being Jewish. The name Auschwitz is a Germanization of Oekim, a city in the southern region of Nazi-occupied Poland, where Auschwitz was constructed. It was a system of several camps that combined extermination and forced labor. The famed Arbeit macht frei sign, which means "work will set you free," was displayed over the entrance at Auschwitz. Prisoners were confined in these mostly brick barracks, which served as sites for forced labor. Prisoners received meager food rations and had to endure severe conditions, with many perishing from starvation. The Auschwitz complex was a system of concentration camps. The main camp was Auschwitz first. Then there was Auschwitz second, which was a concentration and extermination camp, and became the most notorious of the camps, where the majority of the killings took place, and where the crematoria were placed. Also, on this site was a family camp, specifically for Roma and Sinti prisoners. The third largest camp, Auschwitz III, or Monowitz, was an industrial complex of factories at which prisoners were used as slave labor. There were an additional 45 sub-camps around these sites. The Nazis started experimenting with a new poison gas named Zyklon B in the latter part of the summer of 1941. Auschwitz-Birkenau was chosen by the Nazis as the primary destination for the murder of European Jews, as the war went on because of its location and ease of access to the rail network. Since then, the camp was building larger and larger poison gas chambers to use Zyklon B. Jews from all over Europe started to be deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1942. When the killing peaked in 1944, more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews were murdered in a matter of 2 months. Men, women, and children were pulled off the trains, and their valuables were taken away before arriving at the camp. Women and kids were kept apart from men. A Nazi doctor would immediately determine each person's fitness for forced labor, and based on this visual inspection, they were either transported to the camps or the gas chambers. This process was known as selection. Those who were ill, aged, crippled, pregnant, or who were newborns or young children had little chance of surviving this selection. In order to suppress panic, some victims who had been chosen for execution were informed they were going to the showers to get rid of the lice on their bodies before being led to the gas chambers. They were forced to give up any remaining possessions they had and take off every piece of clothing on them. The doors to the gas chambers would be closed and secured after being ushered inside. Those within the chambers were killed by the poison after up to 20 minutes. The SS guards then made the camp inmates remove the corpses from the cells, along with their hair, gold fillings, and teeth. After that, the bodies were cremated. Prisoners who were chosen for forced labor had their clothing and possessions taken away. Their heads were shaved. They received a striped uniform to wear and had an identification number tattooed on them to identify convicts as Jews, Roma, homosexuals, asocials, political prisoners, and so on. Nazi officials also marked colored triangles on their uniforms. Due to malnutrition, illness, and long days of physically demanding work, the life expectancy for forced laborers in Auschwitz was fewer than 6 months. The hard labor and killings continued in Auschwitz until April 10, 1944, when 2 Slovak Jews by the names of Rudolf Vrba and Alfred Wetzler escaped from Auschwitz-Birkenau. They arrived in their home country of Slovakia after about 2 weeks on the run. There, they relay the atrocities happening at Auschwitz to the Allied intelligence and even give details of the camp layout. As World War II grew on and the Allied forces gained ground, the Nazis fell back. The Soviet armies advanced towards Auschwitz in 1944, and in early 1945, the Nazis decided it was best to abandon it. On January 18, 1945, some 60,000 prisoners were marched to Władysław-Śląski, where they were put on cargo trains and sent westward to concentration camps away from the front. About 25% died during the journey from starvation, cold, and exhaustion. Many were even shot along the way in what became known as the death marches. The about 7,000 sick or starving prisoners who remained were found by arriving Soviet troops on January 27, 1945. As the Germans were leaving Auschwitz in 1945, they destroyed some parts of the camp. However, a large part of Auschwitz I and Auschwitz II remained intact and has now been converted into a museum and a memorial. Auschwitz had a wealth of proof of mass murder. Even though most of the camp's warehouses were destroyed by the retreating Germans, Soviet forces discovered the victims' personal things in the abandoned warehouses. Many thousands of men's suits, more than 800,000 pieces of clothing for women, and more than 14,000 pounds of human hair were among these private goods. Originally named Auschwitz Concentration Camp, the memorial was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1979. Since it was liberated in January 1945, the Auschwitz camp complex has remained virtually unaltered. The existing camp facilities, infrastructure, and buildings serve as a somber reminder of history and the German Nazis' crime of genocide. They represent an integral part of a repulsive and horrid death machine that was meticulously planned and consistently brutal. The majority of the facilities at Auschwitz still remain as they were built. The majority of the camp's buildings were already existing structures that the Nazis just repurposed for new uses. The arrangement, spaces, and surviving architecture all still evoke the full historical purposes of the various components. While the exteriors of some of the structures have been redesigned to serve commemorative purposes, their interiors have not been altered. Only a few old structures remain in Birkenau. This is because when it was built, the plan was for it to be a temporary structure. It was erected quickly utilizing materials from demolished houses. It was built on the site of a village that had been demolished. The natural decay processes have been speeding up as a result of the construction strategy utilized to develop those buildings. Nevertheless, every effort is being made to keep them intact, enhance their original structure, and guard against deterioration. There are currently several historical artifacts from the camp and its prison prisoners preserved and stored. The Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum has some on display. Authentic documents, well-preserved photos, and personal objects brought by the deportees are among them, along with post-war survivor testimonials. Majdanek. Majdanek, also called Lublin Majdanek, was a Nazi German concentration and extermination camp on the southeastern outskirts of the city of Lublin, Poland. The camp was built in July 1941 when Heinrich Himmler visited Lublin and instructed Odilo Globoknik, the SS and police commander in the Lublin district, to build a camp for 50,000 prisoners who would serve as workers in the SS and police workshops and at construction sites. In October 1941, the first set of prisoners arrived, mainly Soviet prisoners of war. However, almost all of them died of hunger and harsh weather conditions. Within a year, it was converted into a death camp for Jews. Similar to Auschwitz, Majdanek was not a death camp alone, but also a prison camp and a work camp. It had 7 gas chambers, 2 wooden gallows, and some 227 structures in all, placing it among the largest of the Nazi concentration camps. Although initially built to be used for forced labor rather than extermination, the camp used to murder people on an industrial scale during Operation Reinhard. Operation Reinhard was the code name for the Nazi plan to murder the Jews in the general government district of German-occupied Poland. About 200,000 to 360,000 people were estimated to have been killed at Majdanek, including Jews, Poles, Soviet prisoners of war, and Romanists. The camp was operated from the 1st of October 1941 to the 22nd of July 1944, and during its almost 4 years of existence, some 500,000 persons from 28 countries passed through Majdanek. When the Soviet Red Army entered Majdanek in late July 1944, it was captured nearly intact. This was some 6 months before the liberation of Auschwitz. Only a few hundred prisoners were found alive by the time they got there. In the days leading to its capture by the Soviets' army, the Germans had hastily tried to evacuate Majdanek and burnt documents, several buildings, and the large crematoria. However, the gas chambers and many of the prisoner barracks remained intact. The rapid mobilization of the Soviet Red Army prevented the SS from destroying most of the camp's architecture, and the high-ranking officers failed to remove the most incriminating evidence of war crimes. The camp was liberated by the Red Army on the 22nd of July 1944. Today, Majdanek is a state museum called the Majdanek State Museum and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is a Holocaust memorial museum and education center solely to preserve the memory of atrocities committed by Nazi Germany through the network of concentration, slave labor, and extermination camps and sub-camps of Lublin Majdanek. It houses a permanent collection of rare artifacts, archival photographs, and testimony. The camp today covers about half of its original 2.7 square kilometers, and it is mostly bare apart from its former buildings. In August 2010, a fire accident destroyed one of the wooden buildings that was being used as a museum to house 7,000 pairs of prisoners' shoes. In 2016, the number of visitors to Majdanek State Museum and its branches, Sobibor and Belzec, was about 210,000. This was an increase of 10,000 visitors from the previous year. Visitors include Jews, Poles, and others that wish to learn more about the harsh crimes against humanity. Mauthausen. On the 12th of March 1938, Nazi Germany annexed Austria, and the man who was put in place to serve as the regional head of Upper Austria was August Eigruber. Eigruber was a man who quickly rose through the ranks of the Nazi Party, and by 1936, he was the leader of the Nazi Party in Upper Austria. Eigruber announced that he would be constructing a concentration camp where political opponents and people labeled as criminals or anti-socials would be imprisoned there and forced to work in the granite quarries. The location chosen was the town of Mauthausen. The SS moved the first set of prisoners from the Dachau detention camp to Mauthausen on August 8, 1938. A second concentration camp was to be built by the SS in December 1939, not far from Mauthausen. It was called the Gusen Branch, and it started its cruel operations in May 1940. Following the inception of the war, people were distributed from all across Europe to Mauthausen, which eventually became a giant network of numerous connected camps. The concentration camps with the harshest detention conditions and the highest death rate during this time were Mauthausen and Gusen. The odds of survival for prisoners at the bottom of the camp hierarchy were slim to none. The lives of those who were ill or deemed unusable by the SS were always in jeopardy. At Mauthausen, the SS started constructing a gas chamber and associated facilities in 1941 for the purpose of extermination. In the second half of the war, the number of prisoners sent to Mauthausen increased, and for the first time it included women, whose woman power was utilized as slave laborers in the manufacturing of weapons for the war. Quite a number of subcamps camps were created to house the prisoners near their places of livelihood, if you can even call it that. From the main camp, new incoming prisoners were moved to these camps. Mauthausen increasingly transformed into a camp where the sick and weak were sent to their quiet demise. As the war came to an end and the Nazis retreated, camps close to the front line began to be evacuated to the Mauthausen concentration camp. Numerous means of transport carried tens of thousands of inmates here. The U.S. Army arrived in Gusen and Mauthausen on the 5th of May, 1945. Many inmates continued to pass away in the days and weeks following liberation because they were in such debilitated conditions. At least 90,000 of the approximately 190,000 prisoners who spent 7 years at the Mauthausen concentration camp and its sub-camps perished. Mauthausen was liberated by American forces on May 5, 1945. The camp is now a memorial site and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The U.S. Army initially wanted to use the camp's grounds as a prison for SS members, as well as a facility to care for detainees from freed concentration camps. The former concentration camp was then later transformed into barracks to be used by the Red Army for a brief period after the area had been declared to be a part of the Soviet occupation zone. The former Mauthausen concentration camp was given over to the Republic of Austria by the Soviets on June 20, 1947, with the stipulation that it be used as a suitable memorial site. Large portions of the previous camp had been demolished by the time of the memorial site's official opening. To prevent the spread of potential epidemics, the United States Army set the hospital camp's buildings ablaze. The camp's structural remnants were later taken by residents in the area for use as building materials. The majority of the prisoner camps, the last remaining SS barracks, and the operating machinery from the quarry had all been taken down as part of the memorial site's design. This was done to maintain the memorial site's modest maintenance expenditures. The memorial was officially inaugurated as the Public Mauthausen Memorial in the spring of 1949. A chapel and a secular reflection room had been added as part of the site's renovations. The Republic erected a central memorial, a sarcophagus with the inscription, "May the living learn from the fate of the dead." The first national memorial was unveiled in France in the fall of 1949. In the space where the SS barracks formerly stood, a memorial park was built, and various nations and victim organizations added additional monuments. The former hospital building has been utilized as a museum since 1970. A permanent exhibition on the history of the Mauthausen concentration camp, curated by Hans Maralek, a former Mauthausen prisoner, was put on display here. Most recently, in 2013, a room of names and 2 new permanent exhibits honoring the victims of the Mauthausen concentration camp and its subcamps were inaugurated. Dachau. Dachau was the first ever concentration camp opened in Germany on March 22, 1933. It was intended to be a place to imprison and re-educate political opponents of the Nazi regime. However, just like all the other camps we have talked about today, it quickly became a place of terror and death for people of all backgrounds. On March 22, 1933, Dachau opened its doors to its first prisoner transports. The camp initially had a capacity of 5,000 prisoners, but underwent a lot of expansion, with prisoners being used to build and erect new camps on the grounds of the previous ones. A set of rules were enacted in October 1933 that subjected prisoners to harsh punishments for even the smallest transgressions. It was made sure that the Dachau camp functioned as a model for all subsequent concentration camps. It additionally served as a training facility for SS guards who were stationed all over the concentration camp network. Conditions in Dachau were harsh, extremely harsh. Prisoners faced severe overcrowding, inadequate food and sanitation, forced labor, and brutal treatment by the SS guards. Many prisoners died due to malnutrition, disease, medical experiments, and executions. The camp had a shower room where prisoners were sent under the guise of taking a shower, only to be killed by the release of toxic gas. Over the course of its 12-year existence, Dachau was home to over 200,000 prisoners, of whom an estimated 41,000 died. Many prisoners were killed in the camp's gas chamber, while others died from disease. The cruelty, brutality, and dehumanization practiced at Dachau became a blueprint for the horrors that unfolded in other camps during the Holocaust. Dachau was liberated by American forces on April 29, 1945. The liberators discovered evidence of the camp's atrocities, including mass graves, crematoria, and emaciated survivors. After the war, Dachau was used as a prison for war criminals and later as a displaced persons camp for refugees. In 1965, it was turned into a memorial site and museum to commemorate the victims and educate visitors about the atrocities committed during the Holocaust. Today, the Dachau Memorial Site remains a symbol of remembrance and a reminder reminder of the harsh horrors of the Nazi era. It serves as an important historical site, providing uneasy insights into the crimes against humanity committed during the Holocaust and emphasizing the importance of preserving human rights, promoting tolerance, and preventing such inhumane atrocities from ever happening again. If this video made you curious about the history of Europe and the world at large, check out our other awesome videos on the channel.